Please know that I've just started recording the presentation this moment for anyone else who isn't able to watch it today but wants to watch it in the future.
Aye. I don't know, unmute.
Aren't you supposed to be?
I'm trying to unmute. No, I don't want it. I don't know.
All right, I think it's a good time to start. So, welcome everybody. What a extraordinary. Feel so pleased and delighted that we have so many people who are joining us this evening. With so many people, it's hard for me, honestly, to see everybody's face, and I know that many people have their cameras off, which of course is fine. But I'm trying my best to take a look and see who's here. So welcome to you all. Nonetheless, this is really special. We have a really extraordinary evening planned in which we'll be welcoming Elad Strohmayer from the Israel Embassy to speak with us about the Abraham Accords. You know, so much has been going on in our own country over the last, for quite a while now, that sometimes it's easy to forget that something quite extraordinary happened in Israel this past year, in which we, have done something which we've never been able to do in the past. Well, obviously we have made peace with some of our neighbors, but to this degree and this extent, and as significant as this is, it's really something quite extraordinary and fortunate for us that Elad will be able to help us kind of take it apart and explain it to us a little bit better, talk about what it means and what the implications are. And we just feel so very fortunate. I mean, it's such a gift for us to have such incredible resources just right around the corner. And these days, these are the good things about the coronavirus. They're not many, but the few good things are that you find that there's more opportunities to learn from some really great people because they don't have to, travel to get to you. And no one, you can just turn on your camera and talk and learn. So we're so very appreciative and feel very fortunate that Elad is here. And in just a moment,
I'm willing to travel to Annapolis anytime needed.
I know, and you've been here before, so I don't want to suggest that you haven't. I'm only just saying that, well, it's like, think about how easy it is. You don't have to leave your living room or your office. So let me just really quickly just explain what you can expect this evening. In just a moment, after an introduction by Sarit Brosh, and again, what a treasure she is and a gift to us in our community. Sarit is as well, and we thank her so much. She'll be sharing, just welcoming our guest speaker. But additionally, after that, Elad Strohmayer is going to speak for probably a half an hour. He's a presentation, and we'll be able to ask questions. He'll take time after his presentation for questions. Now, let me explain to you how we are going to do this. You are welcome to either chat a question to everybody or chat a question to me privately. Either way, it's fine. There's no guarantee that everyone's question is going to be answered. However, I will do my best to sift through the various different questions. And again, no, some of them will be coming. The whole Zoom will see some questions of people who choose to just ask them publicly. There'll be, I'm sure, plenty of questions that will come to me privately, so you won't see every question. Nonetheless, I will kind of make a decision about which questions to ask towards the end, and we'll take time for questions afterwards. Also, please know that I have the capacity to mute everyone, and I will continue to mute people if necessary, just because oftentimes people accidentally turn their microphone back on. We don't blame anybody. We know accidents happen, but please, to the best of your ability, if you can make sure to try not to unmute, because it can be kind of distracting, both not just to the person who's presenting, but certainly to anyone who's listening. When we hear another person who's talking on their microphone, all attention goes to that person. So to do your best, keep yourself muted. Thank you so much for being a part of this with us. And just one more time, I'm just sharing for those who are new, I am recording this. So if you don't want your face recorded, probably it won't be, only a handful of faces will be recorded. But if you don't want to be recorded, then make sure that you turn your video camera off. Anyway, Sarit, I turn it over to you to introduce Elad.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Goldstein, and shalom and welcome to you all. I would like to mention that among the audience, there are a few midshipmen with us tonight. Two of them just came from the Israeli Naval Academy, Kurs Chovlim. Okay, and now to our speaker. Elad Strohmayer is not a stranger at our community. He was our honored speaker at the celebration of Israel Independence Day in May 2019. But still, I would like to introduce my dear friend to you. Elad Strohmayer is the spokesperson of the Embassy of Israel to the United States in Washington, D.C., a role that he assumed in July 2018. As the spokesperson, he serves as a resource for editors, journalists, and broadcasters to receive information and official statements on issues relating to Israel. Elad joined Israel's Ministry of Foreign Affairs in February 2010. Upon completing his diplomatic training, he assumed his first post as the Deputy Ambassador at the Embassy of Israel in Luanda, Angola, in November 2010. In August 2012, he became the Deputy Consul General at Israel's Consulate General in Philadelphia. In September 2015, he returned to Israel and served as a desk officer in the North America Division of the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, focusing on Canada, US-Israel relations, and special projects in North America. He served in this capacity until his departure to Washington in July 2018. Elad holds a BA degree in political science and international relations and an MA degree in international relations, diplomacy, and security studies, both from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He is fluent in Hebrew and English with a working knowledge of Portuguese and French. Elad Strohmayer is married to another friend of us, Oren Ben Yosef, who is the consular officer and visa specialist for diplomats and officials at the Israeli embassy. So tonight, Elad will discuss the significance of the Abraham Accords and changes in the geopolitical reality in the Middle East. Elad, the floor is yours.
Toda rabba, and thank you, Sarit, for this warm introduction, and thank you, Rabbi Ari Goldstein, for inviting me. And I know that you remember that I was in Annapolis. All I'm saying that I'm willing to drive even now. We're done with these screens and these COVID restrictions, but maybe we need to be a bit more patient, so we can get it over with, and then we'll be more than happy to meet in person. I have fond memories from visiting the synagogue in Yom Ha'atzmaut and visiting the community. So again, toda rabba and thank you. What I want to do, I want to share with you some points regarding the Abraham Accords, also known as the normalization, the peace accords between Israel and the Gulf countries. I don't want to speak much. I want us to have more time to have a conversation and hear your questions so I can answer them. So I'll start. Sarit already had my introduction, so I'm not going to go all of it again, but really shortly. I started to work as a summer camp shaliach in the Jewish agency. I used to work for the Jewish agency in Israel. You see me here, specifically in Rockville, JCC, outside of Washington, D.C. I was a summer camp shaliach in Capital Camps, belongs to the community here. I've done that for 4 summers. I studied, like you heard, international relations. I always knew I wanted to be a diplomat. And my first posting was in Angola, second posting in Philadelphia. And then in Israel, I was in charge of Canada-Israel relations. And this doesn't come without perks. So one of the perks was meeting this guy. And it was really, really cool, I must say. And today I'm the spokesperson of the Israeli embassy here in Washington, D.C. Now I'm going to start with my presentation. So here you can see my team, my press team. This is the team who is in charge of doing the media affairs for the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C. It's only the 4 of us, like we are in a small country, making a lot of noise, but very few people were very good at it. So this is the team that also worked very hard during the Abraham Accords and before to really bring the Israeli story. Now, I must say it was not easy because in the past 4 years, and I promised Sarit that we're not going to go into politics, so I'm just observing from an outsider. For the past 4 years, everything in the media was about your political situation in the United States. Almost nothing about Israel. It's not always a bad thing, because sometimes when Israel is in the media, it's in bad connections, but a lot of good things also happened to Israel in my 2.5 years when I assumed the role as spokesperson of the embassy. So we wanted to promote that, and this is the team that did that. And here in the picture, it's us on the day of the Abraham Accords and the lawns of the White House. And truly, it really felt we're witnessing a history, because not every day you can say that you went to the White House for a peace signing ceremony. The last one was in the White House was actually in 1993. And a year after, there was another peace agreement with Jordan, but that was in the border between Israel and Jordan. So really, we witnessed the history, so that was really nice. So what I want to do, I want to start now with talking about the geopolitical reality in the Middle East, explaining a little bit how it works, and that will maybe help us understand how we got to the place that we are in it today, i.e. the normalization between Israel and the UAE and Bahrain, and then afterwards more countries joined, but we're talking specifically about the Abraham Accords in that terms. So you see the Middle East here, and in the map that you see in the Middle East, you see the flags of many countries. So I want to characterize how we see in Israel the Middle East, for better and for worse. This is how we divide the different countries of the Middle East. So first and foremost, there is the what we call the Shiite axis, which is the Shiite extremist axis, which is led by Iran. And this is the #1 threat that Israel is dealing with today. It's the Iranian threat, it's the Iranian support of Shiite terrorist organization, and also, by the way, not only Shiite terrorist organizations. So that's #1 axis. The #2 axis is what we call the Extreme Sunni, and that was led by Daesh, ISIS, who got weaker in the past few years, but definitely that's one of the axes. And also to some extent Al-Qaeda, even though that today we know Al-Qaeda is also supported by Iran. These extreme Sunni axis doesn't threat directly Israel. They don't like Israel. They definitely want to see us wiped off the map, but they're not a direct threat like the Iranians are, like the extreme Shiites, if you will. So this is the second one. This is the second, maybe if you want to call it, threat in the Middle East. To some countries, maybe that threat is more important than the Iranian threat, but I'm sharing with you the Israeli perspective. The third axis is what we call the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is more of an ideology. It's a political party, and you see them in our connection. You see them as a political party in Egypt, in Jordan, in Turkey, and also for us, they represent Hamas. So the Muslim Brotherhood is definitely a grave threat to Israel because Hamas is posing as a great threat. And note that, for example, I'm talking about Turkey. Turkey has a big, Turkey as a country is not a threat to Israel, but the presence of the Muslim Brotherhood in Turkey, the fact that Turkey is harboring them and allowing them to shelter there, that is a threat to Israel because we know that from there, they are supporting terrorist activities of Hamas in the region against Israel. So three axes: Iran, the number one threat; extreme Sunni, not a direct threat on Israel, something that Israel see in a very bad way, but not a direct threat; and Muslim Brotherhood, also a threat, second to Iran. The fourth and final axis is what we call the Moderate Sunni. And the Moderate Sunni, these are the countries who eventually normalize the relationship with Israel, and hopefully, or as we say in the Middle East, inshallah, we're going to see more countries joining that circle of peace. Those countries share many of the interests that Israel share, many of the concerns, and this is what helped bring us back together in order to bring peace, if you want, between our countries. So I want to explain a little bit some of the factors in our eyes that brought this peace upon us. The number one is the Iranian threat, of course. The Iranian threat is something that is being shared not just by Israel, it's being shared by the Gulf countries, by the UAE, by Bahrain, by Saudi Arabia, by Egypt, by Jordan. All of them share the same concern of a nuclear Iran. Now, I can tell you that for many years, there were a lot of things underneath the surface with many of these countries. Today, we can even say that Israel had a secret mission in Bahrain. Today, it's not a secret anymore, and we're opening an official mission in Bahrain. By the way, today we opened officially our first official mission in the UAE, so this is an historic day. So we all share the same concern and the same threat from Iran, and underneath the surface, we had a lot of cooperation. And this concern from Iran really helped bring us together in many ways to understand that we need to share intelligence, we need to work together to counter that threat. With that being said, it was underneath the surface. They were our mistresses, if you wanna use that term. They weren't willing to speak out loud about their relationship with Israel. So we have a common threat. I'm a student of international relations. A common threat is one of the main things that brings countries together. But here it was not enough. Even the Iranian threat was not enough to really bring Israel and the Gulf countries together openly, not secretly like we've done so far. So what enabled that to go public with these relations? One of the things that I think was a key factor, very key factor, is the perception, and I'm using the word perception because some people might disagree with that. So I'm talking about a perception, then I'm excusing myself from people who disagree with me. But one of the things was the perception that the United States is leaving the Middle East. And I'll explain. It started actually not with Donald Trump as president, it started with Barack Obama as president. Barack Obama as president made it clear what are the priorities of the United States, and not being involved in the Middle East as much as his predecessor, George W. Bush, was one of them. And then, a lot of people like to contradict Barack Obama and Donald Trump, but apparently when it comes to the Middle East, there was not a big difference between them because Donald Trump actually continued, maybe the rhetoric was different, but he continued a similar policy of saying, we want to be less involved in the Middle East. So the countries in the Middle East that share the same goal and threat from Iran also have a big concern about ISIS, all of a sudden have a perception that the United States wants to leave the Middle East. Now, I'm going to use an analogy that it's not mine to use, but it's by my former ambassador, Ron Dermer. When you're in the region and you have an 800-pound gorilla living the region, who are you going to turn to? You're going to turn to the 250-pound gorilla wearing a yarmulke. This is what you're going to do. So that really helps the perception that the United States is leaving the area. Really helped bring Israel and the countries that see eye to eye the Iranian threat even closer. But even then, it's not enough to go public. You need a reason to go public. For many, many years, these countries didn't go public with Israel, even though we had underneath the surface relations with them because of the Palestinian issue. These countries always said, we are waiting for the Palestinian issue to be resolved. And when that is going to be resolved, then we can move forward. I like to say that the Palestinians had veto power over Israel's relations with the Arab world. And again, now with the Abraham Accords, we saw that this is something that is changing. It's not happening anymore. And one of the reasons that I think that these countries decided to move forward with Israel, actually, there are two things. One of them is the fact that Israel is considered, everybody knows that, as a startup nation, an oasis of technology, democracy, and freedom and human rights in the Middle East. But specifically, when we talk about technology, Israel is considered one of the leading countries in the world. And these countries around us, the UAE, for example, and Bahrain, they want a piece of that as well. They want to cooperate. They want to develop their technological sector. By the way, the UAE is very developed, and they want to even be developed more. So in order to do that with Israel, you cannot do that underneath the surface anymore. You need to go public. If you want to exchange businessmen and exchange technologies and share knowledge about many things, you need to go public. This is part of having warm bilateral relations. So this is something that they needed the excuse how we can move forward now with Israel, because we have this interest first against Iran. Second, we want to invest in technology. So the reason in that that made it possible eventually, I would argue, was the Trump's peace plan. The same peace plan that Trump launched last year. And again, in my 2.5 years here, I actually witnessed several historical events. When he published his peace plan, that was the factor that eventually allowed the Gulf countries to move forward with Israel. And why is that? Eventually, agree or not, and I'm taking politics aside, like Trump, don't like Trump, like Netanyahu, don't like Netanyahu, it doesn't matter. Everybody knows more or less what will be the parameters to the solution between Israel and Palestinians. Everybody knows there are disagreements, there are maybe some ideological issues, maybe politicians say things for the sake of politics, but everybody knows that eventually there's going to be two countries living peacefully side by side, and everybody knows that the territories in the West Bank that controlled by Israel and have a really big population of Israelis in it won't be cleared, and there's going to be land swap. There was even discussion about Jerusalem, how to solve the problem of Jerusalem. These are things that go way back to the Camp David negotiations between Yasser Arafat and Ehud Barak. Nothing is new. The parameters for an agreement were always known. It was always a question how you move forward, and people will argue, and I represent the Israeli side, so my job is to argue that against the Palestinians, but people would argue that there was lack of leadership on both sides. It doesn't matter. The parameters were known. Came the administration, the US administration, with its peace plan and said, these are the parameters, like it or not. We need to invest now in the Palestinian economy. And that was one of the parameters, invest in the Palestinian economy. And under the peace plan, Israel promised to maintain the path for Palestinian statehood open. You heard many times Prime Minister Netanyahu said, I don't think a two-state solution will happen anytime soon. I don't think it's viable. He's not ruling out a two-state solution. He just says, just said that right now, with the reality on the ground, nobody see that happening because there needs to be leadership also on the Palestinian side to agree to it. By the way, again, I'm trying to clean politics of it, so I want to show the other side. That is the same sentiment that was shared by Secretary of State designate Tony Blinken in the hearing in the Senate. When he was asked about a two-state solution, he said, this is what the US policy is going to be under a Biden administration as well. We think it's going to be very difficult to reach to it right now. That's exactly what we're saying. We're saying that this is the policy, it's going to be difficult now. So what we can do now along the way to move forward and to change the reality in the Middle East. So the peace plan talked about economic development and using the region, using the countries in the region to help the Palestinians advance their economy. And people don't know that, but even today, there is a lot of cooperation between Israel and Israelis, not Israel as Israel officially, Israelis and Palestinians. And we want to, on the economic side, and we want to see more. So that was number one. And the number two was laying the ground that we promised to keep the path of a Palestinian statehood open, which means that we said we're not going to apply sovereignty. I'm using the term applying sovereignty and not annexation. In the general debate, it was called annexation, but we in Israel, we call it applying sovereignty. And we gave our word for that for the next 5 years, we're not going to apply sovereignty in the West Bank because we're promising to keep the path for Palestinian statehood open to make sure that we can reach a two-state solution. Now, I can tell you, in the same ceremony in January last year in the White House, it was President Trump that said that he hopes that the Palestinians will say yes and start direct negotiations, and he hopes to open an embassy in East Jerusalem. I can tell you that for an Israeli politicians, for sure from the right, it was not something that was easy to hear, that a US president is saying that he hopes to open an embassy in East Jerusalem. But this is part of the things that Israel has said, that we are opening the path and keeping the path open for a two-state solution for a Palestinian statehood. Now, the reason that I said that, yes, it takes two to tango and it takes leadership on both sides, unfortunately, we said yes to the plan. We said yes to many plans in the past. The Palestinians, again, said no. And that was not a surprise. Like, we knew that no matter what will be brought upon them, they will say no. They said no to the Camp David Accords, and there was a very generous offer given to them at the time by Ehud Barak, and Bill Clinton was the mediator. They said no to the Ehud Olmert proposal when George W. Bush was the president. They said no in numerous occasions, so there was no doubt in our mind, unfortunately, that they would say no. But what is the difference of their saying no right now, them saying no to this very realistic plan eventually? And again, I know that people with politics might disagree, but a lot of people in the region saw this plan as a very realistic. And the UAE and Bahrain, for example, saw this plan as very realistic. And this is one of the things that the administration did. They consulted with the countries in the region, understanding, listen, this is what we're trying to achieve. Do you think that's doable? And the UAE and Bahrain, in my understanding, I was not in the consultations with them, but in my understanding, they said this is a reasonable plan. And the moment the Palestinians said no to what the UAE and Bahrain thought is a reasonable and viable and fair plan, this is what enabled those countries to say enough is enough. The Palestinians don't have veto power anymore on our relationship in the region. And now we want to move forward to normalize relations with Israel. Now we want to move forward and have peace with Israel because A, Iranian threat, B, we want to boost our technological sector, our high-tech sector, and it's like having Oregon, Nevada, Southern California, Utah boycott Silicon Valley. This is basically more or less the same thing that countries in the region boycott Israel, and they want to develop their tech sector. So, like I said, Iran, tech sector, and what they saw that now, I want to help the Palestinians. It's a cause that is very important to these countries, no doubt about it, but they saw that the Palestinians are refuseniks. They say no to whatever has been proposed, and they said, that was a fair proposal, now we can move forward. We had a hurdle, because at the time, and according to the peace plan that was presented last year, Israel could apply sovereignty in some of the territories. Israel could apply sovereignty to some of the territories. And the back and forth conversations, we saw an opportunity that if we're going to suspend applying sovereignty to territories that under the peace plan designated to be part of Israel, then these countries will move forward. And then we said we're willing to do that. We're going to suspend applying of sovereignty in the territories that we know under each peace plan in the past, and including this one, were designated to be to remain in Israel. We agreed to suspend the applying of sovereignty in order to move forward with these countries and really change the face of the Middle East. And that's really what enabled us to bring peace. This is the main and important factor when we talk about the change in the Middle East. That was the main thing. So now I want to talk a little bit about what it means, this peace. And of course, the Abraham Accords were signed during the Corona. So here you can see the mask that I wore the day of the Accords. I have, by the way, the mask here with me. So this is another thing that we can do via Zoom. I can take the props from my home and use that. So that's the same mask here. And I basically explained the why and how and why now. And here, I'm showing off a little bit. This is the ceremony in the White House. I took this picture. I could have shown you the official pictures, and they're much nicer from the center, but this is being part of history. So these are pictures that we took. And again, I know that there are many characters on the stage that can be very controversial to some of the people, but this was historic, signing peace agreements between Israel and two Arab countries. The first one since 1994, the peace agreement we had with Jordan, was a very meaningful moment. And I think even the current administration, the Biden administration, acknowledged that, because President Biden said that he supports the Abraham Accords. Tony Blinken said in his hearing in the Senate that he supports the Abraham Accords, and they hope also to see more normalization agreements between Israel and the Gulf countries. And we saw that we brought Sudan, we brought Morocco, and hopefully, like I said, inshallah, we'll see more countries join into this expanding circle of peace. So now I want to talk about looking forward. Until now, I've done the why and how. Now I want to look forward, what we can look forward to. So from geopolitical interest, now I want to talk about people-to-people diplomacy. And why is that? Because we have already peace agreement with Egypt and with Jordan. And the peace agreement with Egypt and in Jordan are very important to Israel, very important strategically, very important geopolitically. But I hope that we will get to the place with Egypt and Jordan, like we already have reached with the UAE and Bahrain, because the peace with the UAE and Bahrain, the way it's being shaped, the way I see it's being shaped right now, it's going to be very warm. It's going to be between people to people. Now, don't get me wrong. Cold peace, which is the peace that we have with Jordan and Egypt, is so much better than warm war, for sure. But now I hope that Egypt and Jordan will see the model that is being developed between Israel and the UAE and Bahrain, and understand that they have much to gain also from really enhancing a warm peace and a warm relations in many, many aspects. So for example, this picture wasn't taken by me. It was taken by Elal workers in the UAE, and this is the UAE officials greeting farewell to the Israeli official delegation that visited Abu Dhabi for the first time, and that was the first Elal flight that landed in Abu Dhabi. This is a remarkable picture for everything that it symbolizes, and that shows us that what the UAE wants to achieve with Israel is much more than just countering Iran. They want to work with us together to the benefit of the region. And I know it sounds like a cliche, but we really want to try and make the world a better place. We're talking about how we can cooperate in technology in fighting COVID, and technology to eradicate poverty and hunger and desertification, and working on all the important sustainable development goals of the United Nations. We're working together to fight climate change, which is something that is very important and really affect us in Israel and the UAE and Bahrain in the Middle East. So really they understand that they have much to gain and we can work together on that. It's much more than just the Iranian threat. If it was just the Iranian threat, then we would have kept it underneath the surface like we had so far. But I told you that there were different factors. What were the different factors that allowed that? And this is the vice versa. This is the first Etihad airplane landing in Tel Aviv. And you see the flight attendants with the flags and also the American flag, because there was an American delegation and the US was a very important mediator in this relations. These are something that are unique, that are special, and we look forward to see that with more countries. Now, how do we do people-to-people diplomacy? In one aspect is like you saw in these two pictures, having tourism and a lot of tourists coming from both of our countries to each other. So COVID is spoiling the celebration a little bit, unfortunately, but there are many Israeli tourists already flying to Dubai and Abu Dhabi. And we know that there's a lot of interest when things open up and the Ben Gurion airport will open up of tourists from Bahrain and from UAE coming to Israel. And we gave our commitment that they will be able to go to Temple Mountain and pray there. And that's something that, again, when we're going to see this boost of tourism, that really helps bring people to people together. That really helps. It's the economy, it's the economic cooperation and the business cooperation, it's the tourism of exchange of people. It really helps bring people together. So we hope, and these two pictures, they really symbolize the potential that we have in our relations. But another element, and this is a story that I want to share a little bit of my experience before the signing of the Abraham Accords. And this is a picture that I took that you can see here. What you see is Israeli broadcaster and journalist Dana Weiss with her counterpart from the official UAE television, and they're standing next to each other outside the White House. We're waiting to go to the South Lawn for the ceremony, and they're broadcasting together. And this was the behind the scenes that you don't see, because they're standing next to one another, but you don't see that on TV. And I saw their interaction, and I saw the warmth that we got, the Israeli delegation, because as spokesperson, I escorted the journalist that came from Israel. So the Israeli delegation, the warmth that we got from the UAE, from the Bahrain delegation, and that was so endearing to see. And for me, that was the proof that this peace will be different. This peace, we don't need to hide in the closet. We can come out of the closet and be friends like we want to be. And then at the same evening, Yonit Levy, who is the main anchor woman of the main broadcast news show in Israel, broadcast together with her counterparts from Bahrain and Dubai. And they, at the same time that it was live in Israel, it was shown live in their channels. And again, this is something that you don't see us doing with the Egyptian media, unfortunately, or with the Jordanian media. This is really warm peace, that there is a lot of will and interest for people to come together and hear one another and get to know one another. And I see that with the numerous media requests that the ambassador has received from UAE outlets, Moroccan outlets as well. And this is the main difference that we see today. And like I said, inshallah, more countries will join. And also Egypt and Jordan will see that we can gain so much more than just having peace that is based on interest. And again, the peace is very important between Jordan and Egypt, don't get me wrong. But now I think the UAE and Bahrain example and Moroccan example can show everybody that we can take it to the next level. And by the way, I heard Ambassador Yusuf Oteiba, who is the UAE ambassador here in Washington, saying that the burden of proof is on the UAE now. They need to prove to other countries that it's worth it to have peace with Israel, that it's worth it to have peace with Israel, and then other countries will join. So this is really an example of how we can work together. And again, it's a cliche, but I believe in this cliche, to make the world a better place. And this is a very important picture, and I think we'll end with this picture and then open it up for question. The fact that this picture was shared all over the UAE and Bahrain the day the Abraham Accords were signed says a lot. And Jerusalem is Israel's capital, no doubt about it. But we also acknowledge that it's important for other religions. And Jerusalem, this is an official lighting by the municipality of Jerusalem, is happy to welcome people from the UAE and Bahrain, and yes, from Jordan and Egypt, to come and prayer in the sites that are holy to Muslims and Christians and Jews, because this is the beauty of Jerusalem. And the fact, and I maybe should have mentioned that as well, but the fact that after the United States announced that its embassy is being moved to Jerusalem, a move, by the way, that the Biden administration is not going to reverse, and the world continued, and the Arab world didn't, the sky didn't fall, and the Arab world didn't cut its ties with Israel. That's a proof that you can move forward toward peace from a place of strength and believing in yourself and in your cause, but also by stretching your hand in peace and offering everything that peace has to offer. Better a future for all of us economically and in any other sense. So I'll finish with that. And this is a picture of something that, two pictures here. On the right, you see filter that we did, especially for the Abraham Accords for peace, with the flags of Israel, the UAE, and Bahrain. And this picture was taken from within the Blair House when I accompanied the Prime Minister in his visit. And then on the left, you see my husband and I in this historic day, at the end of this historic day, actually, on the lawns of the White House. And hopefully we'll see more historic days coming, because I'm an optimistic, and I think we have a very bright future ahead of us. So toda rabba, and now I'll be very happy to answer your questions.
Well, thank you so much, Elad. I mean, it was a great, clear presentation, and there have been a number of questions. First of all, how would you feel about, at this point, if we could stop the share?
Yes.
So people can see each other, but also you most specifically. And what I'll do is I will spotlight your screen. Now most people seeing you. Nice and big, by the way. So, so be careful, make sure you've got all the things behind you put away. No, you've got, everything's fine. Oh, there's the mask. Very good. So a number of questions have come to me, and I'd love to, ask you some questions. So I'm asking questions on behalf of people. And so we can have a conversation together, knowing that I'm really channeling the people. So a number of people asked about now, and we know you are not a prophet, at least not that we know, or tell us if you're a prophet, but we know you're not a prophet, and we know that, it's very hard to predict things, but, how do you see the relationship between the United States and Israel now moving forward under this new administration? You mentioned about that Biden is going to continue to keep the embassy in Jerusalem, and I think that may be a done deal for a while now. I think it's showing, as you point out, that the world didn't collapse when it happened, much that we thought it might. But so what do you see moving forward, especially considering your relationship with the United States? How do you see it going from this moving forward?
I'm very optimistic, because when I look at, first and foremost, President Biden, I think for years we didn't have a president in the White House that has such a rich and very rich, actually, I don't need other words, connection to Israel and knowledge on the foreign policy issues. President Biden, since his first days in the Senate and in the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee, and then as vice president, really worked on all the important issues for us. So he's very well attuned and very well familiar with the issues. He's hitting the ground running. There is no learning curve. If we look at all the other presidents, even the friendliest one that we had, like Donald Trump, I don't take it away from him at all. Nobody came with the same experience that Biden had. And also, I think Biden, in his 30 years of service, or even more, I would say, really shown himself as a true friend of Israel, visited Israel numerous times. So I think during the Biden presidency, we have much to expect with the friendship between our two countries. And I'll take it down. It's not just Biden. If I look at his vice president, Kamala Harris, also many times, even though she was she was a junior senator, many times expressed her support of Israel. We look at his choice for Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, again, very friendly. So I think the prospects are very high. And also, we need to remember several things. First, our relations are rooted much more than just the identity of a president or a prime minister. Our relations are based on shared values and shared interest. And this is something that goes way back before Biden, before Trump, before Obama, and I can go further back with that, and definitely before Netanyahu. So when we talk about shared values of freedom, democracy, human rights, that's something that Israel and the US share, and it's very important for us. Israel is considered for the United States, and again, a lot of people use it as a slogan, but this is true. Israel is considered to the United States as a beacon of democracy in an island of a non-democratic entities, and that's something that is very important to the United States. And in addition, of course, the shared interest, the fact that there is very important intelligence sharing between our countries, cooperation on cybersecurity, issues that are critical for the national security of the United States. That's something that transcends political parties. So when I take all of this together, both the strong affiliation that Biden has toward Israel and the fact that the relations are so strong, regardless of Biden and Netanyahu, or Trump and Netanyahu for that matter, I'm very optimistic. Now, true, there are issues that we might disagree on. True that there are issues that we might even argue on. But look around you, everybody, and look in your families. How many times did you argue with your wives and husbands and siblings and kids? It happens. It's okay. And it's not the end of the world. And you know what? I can guarantee you that we're going to have disagreements with the administration. And I can guarantee you that there are going to be people with political interest that will try and present these disagreements as the end of the world. And that's it. That's the end of the Israel-US relations. Don't buy that, because not every disagreement between our two governments, it's the end of the world. Governments are allowed to disagree. The US and Canada has many disagreements. I think if I look at Canada, for example, and I covered Canada for 3 years in Israel, the Keystone Pipeline, if you're familiar with that topic, it's oil pipeline in Canada that goes into the United States, is something that is extremely, extremely important to Canada. Extremely important. Obama canceled it, and Canada didn't like it. Trump reenacted it because Obama canceled it because of environmental issues. Trump brought it back. Canada was very happy. Now, it's no secret that under Trump, the relations between Canada and the United States were not so good, but Canada was very happy. And one of the first things that Biden did, one of his first executive orders, was to cancel again the Keystone Pipeline. So clearly Canada was not happy about that, but I'm sure that the relations between Canada and the United States are very, very strong. And the first phone call that Biden did as president was with Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada. So if Canada and the US can do that, definitely Israel and the US can disagree on some topics without everybody shouting, oy vey, it's the end of the world. It's not. The relations are very strong, and I'm very hopeful in that sense.
The oy veys come from Israel's side, not from, we don't say oy vey in America too
Well,
much.
sometimes maybe in the Jewish community you can.
Maybe in the Jewish community. I don't see the State
and now
Department.
I see my friend Chezi joining in. Hi, Chezi. Good to see you.
So let me ask you something. Let's talk a little bit more about the, and I'm going to go all over the place. I'm just trying to address various different questions and go all over. So, back to the Abraham Accords. I always thought that it would be Saudi Arabia would be the first to jump in on this game, but clearly it wasn't. What's kept Saudi Arabia from being a part of this? And do we see anything down the Keystone Pipeline for Saudi Arabia with respect to relationship?
I don't want to comment about the prospects of other countries, because I think one of the reasons that we were so successful with the Abraham Accords is that it was kept quiet and we didn't talk about it. Definitely, if Saudi Arabia will join in, it's going to be a huge win and very important. Saudi Arabia is an extremely important country, but there are many, many factors you need to consider when moving forward in normalizations. Not every country is similar in its composition, in its internal politics. So everything was aligned eventually for the UAE and then Bahrain to join in. And hopefully we will see other countries joining in very soon.
All right, let me move it to a slightly different direction. And again, you're not an expert on America's foreign policy, and I know that. However, you are a spokesperson for Israel with respect to America's foreign policy. So how do you see, we know about the way that Obama worked with Iran regarding the deal with Iran. And then we know about how Trump felt about that deal with Iran and what he did with respect to that deal. And I have heard, although I don't know where what's left, is that Biden is going to figure out how to maybe see if we can recreate that. Now, so again, you're not an expert in America's foreign policy, I know, but speaking from the perspective of Israel and the Israel embassy, how do you, what are your thoughts about what's going on, what might happen down the line with respect to Israel and Iran and how that affects, America and Iran and how that affects Israel?
So I think in that sense, it's very important to note several things. First, all of the three presidents, Obama, Trump, and now Biden, share the same end goal as Israel regarding Iran, to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. There is no doubt about it. For us, in that sense, no differences between the three presidents. No one of them wanted to see Iran nuclear, and all of them understood that Iran is a threat to the region. Where the disagreements were around the tactics, around the strategy, how to come about that. We thought and still think that the best way to do that is by applying pressure and sanctions on Iran. And when they are stretched to the corner well enough, then they will come to the table and we can negotiate a deal that will prevent them from obtaining a nuclear weapon. And by the way, at the beginning, we give credit to President Obama for really enacting a very strong regime of sanctions regime against Iran. He did what nobody did before him. And the fact that this sanctions regime was so good, this is what brought Iran to the table to negotiate. But the problem was, in our opinion, it was a little bit too early. And the outcome for us, again, proved that, because we're not against a deal, but we were against the deal that eventually legitimized Iran's path to nuclear weapon. And why do I say legitimized Iran's path to nuclear weapon? The deal, first and foremost, didn't deal with several problems like the ballistic missiles program, the Iran malign activity in the Middle East, supporting terrorist organizations, terrorist groups that affect, by the way, not only Israel. It's not just Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. It's also supporting the Shiite militias in Yemen, the Houthis in Yemen, and the Shiite militias in Iraq, Hezbollah, of course, in Lebanon. So all these elements were not dealt with in the original nuclear deal. Right now, already we hear President Biden saying that when trying to negotiate a new deal with Iran, that's something that he wants to include. Definitely a very positive development in our side, in the way we see it. But important to add another thing. One of the things, and I'm not an expert on nuclear science, and I'm not going to go into all the technical, I'm speaking in headlines. One of the things that the original nuclear deal with Iran said, there were what we called the sunset clause. Clauses that after 5 years and then 10 years and 15 years, the limitations on the Iranian nuclear program, on the enrichment, on the R&D of the centrifuges, on the amount of enrichment uranium that they're allowed to have, were lifted. And basically what we said, the problem is not with today or with tomorrow. The problem was not with today or tomorrow. The problem was in 5 years after the agreement, and we're very close to it. We actually passed it already. The first sunset clause passed already, but the US left the deal. And then every 5 and then 10 years, another restriction was lifted out of Iran. And eventually, this is what we say, it's legitimized their way to a bomb, because in 15 years after the agreement, the restrictions that they had over their nuclear component, I said, the ballistic missiles and the malign activity was not even included. Talking about the nuclear component, the uranium enrichment was lifted gradually. And we said, this is a problem. This is something that needs to be addressed. That was a disagreement that we had with the Obama administration, because the Obama administration said, well, we can do that along the way, because eventually we can bring Iran back to the family of nations. We said, not going to happen. We understand the way the Ayatollah regime works, the way they think, the way they talk about annihilating Israel. That was a main problem for us. Now, this is where the question lies of what the Biden administration do. Again, the fact that they're already saying that they want to address the ballistic missiles and the malign activity is amazing and it's important, but now we need to make sure that the nuclear component, the sunset clause, all the elements in the original deal that enabled Iran after 5 and 10 and 15 years to go back to the same level of uranium enrichment. This is the problem that we have, and we need to see if Biden administration is going to tackle that. Now, granted, Biden just started his administration a few days ago. I think he has bigger fish to fry right now. Somebody said COVID. So we need to wait and see about that. We don't know. What we can already say right now is that we think that going back to the deal right now as maybe confidence measure with Iran is a mistake, because the fact that we have now against sanctions against Iran will help the Biden administration and any other administration for that matter, it doesn't matter, to really come and push Iran to negotiate a better deal that Israel can live with and that we think is a good one. So if Biden administration wants to get to what we call JCPOA 2.0, the best way to get to that JCPOA 2.0 is not to go back to the JCPOA 1.0. It's to continue with the sanctions, and then when the situation will be very, very dire to Iran, they will come back to the table like they did before. Now, I'm already advancing maybe a question that some people might ask. People will say, well, Trump withdrew, and I don't speak for the Trump administration, I speak for the Israeli government. But saying Trump withdrew from the nuclear deal, Trump enacted sanctions, and now we see that Iran is even closer to a bomb because they're violating their commitments and they're enriching uraniums even more. This is a very, I would say, twisted way to look at it. I don't want to say false, because I think each person is entitled to his opinion, but I think it's a twisted way to look at it for several reasons. First, the sanctions by Trump were reenacted a year ago, so just more or less. It took several years for the sanctions that Obama enacted to be effective. So we need to be patient. We need to be patient with the sanctions and give them time to work, because at the beginning, until Trump withdrew from the deal, and then there were waivers on several industries that he gave to certain countries on the oil sector, et cetera, et cetera. So we need to give time to the sanctions to work. We need to continue. That's number one. Number two, I think Iran is now violating the agreement as part of negotiation tactics, so that when Biden will want to engage with them, they will stop the violation and they will say, you see, we're good people, we want to negotiate, and everybody in the international community will say, oh, Iran is trying to behave itself, they stop the violations. I don't buy this tactic, it's a tactic. And eventually, we can live with a violation that we know of and we can deal with, then again, going back to an agreement that, like I said, with the sunset clause, legitimize the bomb. And this is the problem. So if you ask our opinion, what's the best way to deal with the Iranian nuclear threat? 3 legs to the Iranian nuclear threat that we should have. Number one, crippling sanctions. We had that during Obama. Trump reenacted the sanctions, but it was still not enough because we needed more time. So we need more time to the sanctions today. So number one, crippling sanctions. Number two, credible military threat. And this is important. I'm not saying that we want to attack Iran tomorrow, and I don't say that I want the United States to attack Iran tomorrow. On the contrary, I want to avoid war. But if this is what we're going to say all the time, that we want to avoid war, and we won't show Iran that we're meaning business, then they'll have more incentive to violate the nuclear agreement, because they need to see that we mean business, that if you're going to violate and you're going to continue and pursue your way to the bomb, we're going to enact more sanctions on you, and we're willing to take the military route if needed, then it will help them better behave. The third leg, and that's also very important, is the outreach to the Iranian people. And when I say outreach to the Iranian people, is making sure the Iranian people understand that our feud is not with the Iranian people. Israel and Iran had amazing relationship until the revolution. Until today, you can find people in Israel. I spoke to several people who said, yeah, I was born in Tehran. My father was the ambassador of Israel in Iran. You know, these are things that sound like science fiction today, but our problem is not with the Iranian people. The Iranian people are amazing. They're smart. They deserve a better life. And we want them to have a better life. So all the actions that we're taking, the crippling sanctions and the credible military threat, is not against the Iranian people, it's against the Iranian regime. And that's something that needs to be very clear. And this is why I'm saying outreach to the Iranian people. So 3-leg strategy: crippling sanction, credible military threat, outreach to the Iranian people. That's the best way to tackle the Iranian nuclear threat. And right now, if we want to get to a better deal that deals with all the problem, we need to be even stronger on this 3-leg strategy.
Yeah. By the way, just to emphasize what you're saying, I mean, Iran it's not even, if it's a minority, it's just barely a minority. So many people in Iran are forward-thinking, sophisticated people who care about democracy even, and you're like, that really is a great makeup of Iran. Iran is not, you know, like they had an Arab Spring, what was it, 10 years ago? They were the first, which had we supported it a little bit better, Iran could be a different place right now. And I remember 20 years ago, they had elections in Iran, which I thought they were going to have almost turn over to a democratic parliament. I mean, Iran is close. So I certainly think that when we demonize Iran, we have to be careful with how much we demonize them.
100% I agree. And I want to emphasize one thing though. I'm not advocating for a regime change. It's not mine to make. Regime change is a complicated thing. And I know that there are many opinions in the United States. Even within Democrats and Republicans, there are not just between Democrats and Republicans, there are disagreements on that, but even within the parties, there are disagreements. This is not what I'm advocating for. I'm advocating for changing their behavior and making sure we have all the guarantees under an agreement to prevent them, because I'm not advocating for a regime change, because I don't trust them. Because for sure, the moment there is going to be a regime change and we're going to have a different regime that we can work with, everything changes. We don't need like safeguards agreement like that with the United States. So because we don't trust them, this is why our demand from an agreement with Iran are very, very high. Now, I'm honest, I'm not going to shed a tear if the regime is going to collapse in Iran, for the better of the world and for the better of the Iranian people. But this is not our policy. This is not something that Israel is advocating for. This is something that the Iranian people should want. Like you said, they were very, very close. And hopefully in the future, the conditions will allow them to get there. But I'm not asking the US to intervene and change the regime there. Israel doesn't think that we can do that. We just want to make sure that we can change the behavior of the regime. And maybe through that, things will change. I'm an optimistic.
Yeah, I don't want to keep it. We're going to probably stay on for another 5 to 7 minutes. So I'm just trying to give everyone a sense of our timing of things. But, you know, like, first of all, what's remarkable about the Abraham Accords is just how much it's the umbrella to so many other, it covers so much more than just the relationship with these countries. I mean, you know, our relationship with the UAE it's beautiful what we're creating, or Bahrain, it's beautiful what we're creating, Morocco, but what's remarkable really is how it affects so much other stuff. And so therefore, you know, I think about, you know, the Palestinians and about how our relationship with the Palestinians is affected as a result of the Abraham Accords, which you described really beautifully. I want to ask a question that someone brought up, and I was interested in it too when you mentioned it, and I was kind of hoping maybe you could talk a little bit more about it. You were mentioning about the American embassy in Jerusalem, and then you said, look, there's room for, you know, for American embassy in East Jerusalem also.
I didn't say that. I said the president said that.
Sorry, fair enough.
The president said that. I didn't say it.
Fair enough. So sorry.
It's very difficult for Israelis to hear that.
No, that's where I was going with this, and then I think you mentioned, and now maybe I have to check myself about this, about how you said there can even be a plan with respect to Jerusalem. Did you say that? Or
Yes, I said there was even agreements in the past about how you solve Jerusalem, about East Jerusalem, West Jerusalem. There were agreements in the past, and there were creative solutions. I don't want to go into them because they were a very long time ago. But there were solutions that were brought upon the table that were basically agreed upon at the time between Ehud Barak and Yasser Arafat. What broke the Camp David negotiations in 2000 was the right of return. The fact that Arafat could not give up the right of return. And this is, by the way, when we talk about recognizing Israel as a Jewish state, this is what we mean when we talk about the right of return, because they want all the refugees to be able to come back to Israel, not to the Palestinian state. By all means, when there's going to be a Palestinian state, everybody they want can go live there. We're not going to prevent that. But not everybody can come live in Israel. And this is one of the key problems. Now, if we have time, I can elaborate more a little bit about the refugee issue if you want. Because that's a complicated issue.
It's a very complicated issue. We may actually have to we may save it for the next time you come and speak to us. But I mean, no, I hear you. It is it's a huge issue. And I was wondering if you could elaborate more on Jerusalem, but now I'm hearing you clearly say that it's really, yes, there are plans, but it was also a past plan with respect to Barak and not necessarily a current kind of conversation that's happening.
I think it's solvable. I think it's solvable. And I say what I say in cautious. I know this is an open discussion and it's being recorded, but so I say it with cautious. When you look, and again, I'm cleaning politics of it, please. When you look, the day Donald Trump recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital, I thought that was one of his most thoughtful speeches that he made. He didn't improvise, he didn't say whatever. It was a very thoughtful speech because he said, we recognize Jerusalem, which is where the Israeli government sits and we already de facto recognize it as the capital. We recognize it as Israel capital. He didn't put boundaries. He didn't say East Jerusalem or West Jerusalem. He didn't say anything that can annoy anyone in that perspective. And this is very not Donald Trump, by the way. He says everything that annoys everybody. And in that sense, he actually chose words that were very, very, very careful, saying we recognize Jerusalem where the Israeli government sits as the capital. He didn't talk about boundaries and he didn't divide it. He didn't do anything because everybody knows, and this is what I'm saying with cautious, everybody knows that there are areas that are more Palestinians and areas that are more Israelis. So I think these issues about Jerusalem are eventually solvable because like the territories, I love it when people blame everything about the settlements because you might disagree with building on the settlements and that's fine, but it was never the problem because everybody knows that Ma'ale Adumim and Ariel and all the big bulks will stay under Israel and there's going to be a land swap. It was agreed upon in every plan. And by the way, even the Palestinians agreed on that. They always said no because of the right of return. They always said, and this is the refugee thing, this is the problem. This is where the problem lies. Not Jerusalem. Not that I'm saying that Jerusalem is going to be easy. It's politically difficult. But everything I think is more solvable. The refugee, the right of return, what they call, that's going to be there.
And I have a lot of confidence in what the future looks like, especially as a result of the Abraham Accords. Last question for you, and it's a really hard one or a really easy one, depending on the way that you choose to approach it. But just because, again, this is about the Abraham Accords, dream a little bit. What do you think? How do you see the Abraham Accords? What it meaning like 5 years from now or 10 years from now? Like what will we be able to kind of look at as what did it all mean because of these recent?
I was looking at my bookshelves because I thought I brought that book with me, but I didn't. Unfortunately, it's in Israel. That's why I was looking at it. And like you said, dream a little bit. So I'm going to dream. When I was in high school, I wrote a paper about the new Middle East and how there can be a cooperation on water technologies and water treatment and water transferring pipes in the Middle East between Israel and its neighbors. And I based this paper on the book called The New Middle East by Shimon Peres, the late President Shimon Peres, who wrote this book, I think, before he was prime minister. I don't remember now the year, maybe as foreign minister, but he had a vision of the new Middle East. So if I'm allowing myself to dream, a lot of people said that Shimon Peres was the Herzl of our time, Herzl was the visionary of the Jewish state. A lot of people say that Shimon Peres is the visionary of peace. And
I'll do your order as soon as he's done, okay?
So I really hope that if I need to dream, is that the dream is of the new Middle East of Shimon Peres, that he was the visionary of peace, and that we're gonna see all of us in the region living peacefully, and we have so much to do together. And I think the Abraham Accords show us that. The fact that we're talking about cooperation on water technologies and fighting COVID and fighting climate change, it shows us that the potential is huge. So imagine if we have Jordan and Egypt and Saudi Arabia and Syria, inshallah, they'll have peace there, and Lebanon, and you know what? And Iran, not under this Ayatollah extremist regime. We can do so many great things together in the Middle East. We'll have flights all over. It's going to be a hub for tourism, for commerce, for technology, for everything. This is my long-term vision. Call me dreamer, call me naive, call me whatever you want, but you told me to dream big from the Abraham Accords. That's my big dream.
Look, it's if it's going to start, I mean, this is the way. I mean, because what's happening is Israel's becoming more normalized as a partner to its neighbors in that region, and they're no longer the pariah. We're no longer, you know, and now we can participate, and who knows what that means. We have a lot of things we can offer these places.
I'll finish with a silly dream, okay? Because the silliest dream are the best dreams, right? So I'm a huge fan of Disney. If you look here a little bit, you can see a lot of Disney figurines.
Oh my God! Yes.
On my bookshelf. I'm a huge Disney fan, and it was Walt Disney who said, "If you can dream it, you can make it happen." So ever since I was a kid, and I saw that, and I love Disneyland and Disney World, and I saw that they opened Euro Disney in Paris, I said, oh, I wish we had a Disney theme park in Israel. But then I said, nobody will come to a Disney theme park in Israel because we don't have any relations with our Arab countries. So why, money-wise, it's not worth it. So ever since I was a kid, I hoped for the day that we're gonna have peace with our neighbors, and then we're gonna have, like, there's Disneyland Paris and Disneyland Tokyo, we're gonna have Disneyland Middle East, and there's gonna be, you know, in Disneyland you have many theme parks, so you have the Magic Kingdom and you have Epcot, etc., etc. And I said there's gonna be the Peace Religious Center, and it's gonna be something that all three religions live peacefully, and it's a small world ride from Disney, put that in the Middle East with all the religious and singing Kumbaya together. It's a small world after all. That was my dream as a kid. And I think that if that dream will come true, I'll be the happiest man alive.
Im tirtzu ein zo agada. I believe that was Walt Disney who said that, right?
Well, our Walt Disney. That's our Walt Disney who said that.
Elad,
our visionary.
Sarit, I don't know if you wanted to say one final goodbye, but Elad, thank you so much. By the way, I saw there were some other questions in the, we couldn't get to them all. There were, but a lot of people made some very valuable questions having to do with nuclear power plants and nuclear energy. But I was so much, we couldn't get to, I was concerned that I was going to getting a little bit too specific with you about these types of things.
It means that I just need to come back.
That's exactly right. We got to bring you back again. So thank you. But I'll just tell you how appreciative, how much we learned from you and how grateful we are for taking the time to spend with us. Sarit, do you want to say anything before we bring this to a conclusion?
Thank you, Elad, for a wonderful presentation. I think that everyone learned tonight so much, and I hope that soon we will have peace with more Arab countries, and we will live together peacefully. And
amen and amen.
Thank you so much. For me, as an Israeli, and I'm not that young, I truly remember when I was in elementary school, all of the Arab countries wanted to throw the Israelis to the sea, to the Mediterranean Sea. So now with every peace agreement with every Arab country, it's a big achievement. More and more Arab countries are recognizing Israel.
Rabbi and Sarit, here's a suggestion to you. when this COVID craziness will be over, I think you should arrange a synagogue delegation to Israel and then take advantage of the fact that now we have direct flights from Israel to the UAE and continue from Israel to the UAE and meet the Jewish community there, and maybe to Bahrain. There is a Jewish community in Bahrain as well, and that will be an Abraham Accords peace delegation.
Absolutely. Well, we take a trip every other year from Temple Beth Shalom, and we missed our trip this past year because for obvious reasons. But we're planning on going back again in 2022. So if anyone wants to join with Temple Beth Shalom, you're always welcome to be a part
Count
of our
me in,
temple.
like in Taglit, like in Birthright. I'll be the mifgash. I'll be the one that you count me in. I'll count me do both to Israel and then the UAE and Bahrain.
Oh, you know what? I have this recorded, by the way. I'm gonna remind you of it.
Just to remind to our community that we have connections with the Jewish community in Bahrain. Do you remember the Bahrainian ambassador that was Jewish, and she came to visit to the U.S. Naval Academy, and we invited the whole community.
Indeed,
Many of you were there.
Thank you so much, Elad. Thank you to everyone who came and watched. Welcome to our midshipmen who are here. We're so glad to welcome you. To all who are in our community, we're delighted to have you part of this. And I know from there were some from outside of Maryland also who tuned in. So thank you and welcome to everyone who was part of this with us.
Thank you. Toda rabah.
Good night.
Laila
Tov.
Laila
Laila
Tov.
tov.
Take care.
תודה רבה אלעד, תודה.
תודה רבה.
תודה רבה.
לילה טוב, שרית, לילה טוב.
לילה
רבה.
טוב.
להתראות. ביי ביי.
ביי אלעד, תודה רבה.
להתראות. auf Wiedersehen. לילה טוב, אדוני הרבי.
תודה רבה, חזי. לילה טוב.
לילה טוב. Rabbi, nice to see you.
Yes.
Thank you. Oh, Howard, nice to see you too.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Rabbi.
All right, I'm going to hang up on everybody.
Yes.
Fareed, thank you.
Thank you.
Rabbi, thank you.
Herb, take care.